Good day to you, dear listener. Pull up a comfortable chair, pour yourself a cup of tea, and allow me to whisk you away to the sleepy English village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing is ever quite as peaceful as it seems. My name is Jane Marple, Miss Marple to most, and I have rather a habit of noticing things that others overlook. Today I invite you to join me in untangling a most curious little puzzle, one that begins, of all places, with a washerwoman's clue. Chapter 1. The Body in the Laundry Basket. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a thin September frost, the sort that turns every blade of grass into a needle of silver and makes the church spire look as though it had been dipped in icing sugar overnight. A low mist drifted across the duck pond, and the only sounds were the distant clop of the milkman's horse and the soft, rhythmic creak of Miss Jane Marple's knitting needles as they moved in her small, bow-windowed sitting room. Miss Marple knitted the way other people breathed, automatically, neatly, and with absolute certainty about the pattern. A pale blue baby's jacket was taking shape on her lap, destined for the next christening whether the mother wanted it or not. She had reached the second sleeve when the morning piece was rent by a shriek so piercing that even the rooks rose in protest from the elms behind the vicarage. "Good heavens above," came a voice from the lane, shrill with outrage rather than terror. "There's a man in Mrs. Bantry's laundry basket, and he's quite dead." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. She laid the knitting aside, reached for her neat gray coat and the sensible felt hat she kept on the hall stand for just such eventualities, and stepped briskly into the crisp air. By the time she reached Gossington Hall, 10 minutes if one took the shortcut across the footbridge and through the stile behind the Blue Boar. Half the village appeared to have converged on the gravel sweep in front of the house. Colonel Bantry, purple in the face and still in his dressing gown under an ancient British warm, was attempting to shoo people away with the same gestures he had once used on unruly sepoys. "Stand back, confound you. This is private property." His wife Dolly, wrapped in a fox fur that had seen better decades, fluttered beside him like a distressed peahen. "Oh, Arthur, do stop roaring. The poor man is dead, not deaf." The poor man in question lay exactly where he had been discovered, head first in an enormous wicker laundry basket on the back terrace, legs protruding at a most undignified angle. He still wore immaculate gray spats over polished black shoes, and one arm had flopped outward as though he had been trying to hail a taxi that never came. Mrs. Price, the vicarage daily, stood wringing her hands, apron clutched to her mouth. "I only came round the side path as usual," she repeated for the 5th time. "The basket was there instead of in the scullery lid half off. I thought Mrs. Bantry had left it out for me special. I lifted the corner, and there he was." Dr. Haydock, who had been fetched from his breakfast kippers, knelt beside the basket and sniffed delicately. "Cyanide," he announced, sitting back on his heels. "Prussic acid, I'd say. Smell those bitter almonds. Death almost instantaneous." Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the little knot of onlookers, now moved forward with the gentle determination of a battleship entering harbor. She peered over the rim of the basket, adjusted her pince-nez, and studied the corpse with the same polite interest she might have shown a new species of rose. "Dear me," she said softly. "Poor Mr. Reginald Dyer." Colonel Bantry gaped. "You know him?" "Of course. He was the junior partner in Dyer and Son solicitors of Milchester. He handled old Mr. Harmon's will last Michaelmas. Those spats are quite unmistakable. Mother-of-pearl buttons shaped like tiny acorns. He was inordinately proud of them." Mrs. Bantry gave a small, hysterical giggle. "Only you, Miss Marple, would recognize a man by his spats when his face is buried in my best damask tablecloths." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "One notices these things." By 11 o'clock, Inspector Dermot Craddock of the County Constabulary had arrived from Much Benham in a black Wolseley that scattered gravel like buckshot. He was a tall, dark young man with a faintly resigned air, as though he had long ago accepted that his career would be punctuated by elderly ladies who knew more than he did. He greeted Miss Marple with the wary affection of a favorite nephew. "Aunt Jane. I might have known. Dermot, dear, coffee is in the drawing-room, though I'm afraid it is not the pot that killed Mr. Dyer. That one has been taken away for analysis." Craddock sighed. "Cause of death confirmed?" "Potassium cyanide in the coffee taken between 7 and 7:30 this morning," Dr. Haydock said briskly. "Stomach contents will tell us more, but the smell is unmistakable." Craddock turned to the Bantrys. "And neither of you saw him arrive?" Colonel Bantry bristled. "I was out riding at 7, back just after 9. Ask the stable lad." Mrs. Bantry pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips. "I was asleep. Ghastly headache. Took 2 aspirin and never stirred till my maid brought tea at 8:30. Craddock's gaze swept the terrace, the overturned basket, the faint wheel marks in the dew on the grass, the scullery door standing ajar. "Someone moved the basket after the murder," he murmured. "It belongs in the scullery. Why bring the body out here?" Miss Marple's eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, rested on the wheel marks. "To be found, of course," she said quietly. "Murderers are often anxious that their handiwork should be discovered. Sometimes they even arrange a pretty tableau." Mrs. Bantry gave a faint shriek. "Tableau? In my laundry basket?" "Exactly so," said Miss Marple, and there was a faint, compassionate smile on her lips. "Now, if someone would be kind enough to offer me a cup of that coffee, I should be much obliged. One likes to keep one's strength up on these occasions." As she followed Mrs. Bantry indoors, she paused beside the basket and bent to examine something caught on the wicker rim. A single thread of white cotton, almost invisible against the pale cane. She tucked it carefully into her handbag, closed the clasp with a soft click, and went in to take coffee with the chief suspects in what was already shaping into a very puzzling morning indeed. Chapter 2. The 5 People Who Might Have Done It. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall smelled of wood smoke, coffee that had been kept too long on the hot plate, and the faint, expensive hysteria of Mrs. Bantry's French perfume. A small mahogany table had been pulled up to the fire. Upon it sat a silver tray, with Worcester cups so thin they were almost transparent, and a plate of Marie biscuits that nobody touched. Inspector Craddock stood with his back to the Adam mantelpiece, notebook in hand, looking like a man trying to conduct an orchestra that insisted on playing different tunes. Around him, in a half-circle of uneasy chairs, sat the 5 people who had been in or near the house that morning. Colonel Bantry, now properly dressed in tweeds that smelled faintly of stables, glowered at nobody in particular. Mrs. Bantry, still clutching the fox fur as though it were a life-belt, kept murmuring, "How perfectly ghastly," every 30 seconds, like a stuck gramophone. Miss Philippa Curtis, the Colonel's secretary, sat very straight on a tapestry stool. She was 28, coolly beautiful in the way that makes other women say cat under their breath. And today she wore a dove-gray frock that matched the shadows under her eyes. Her left hand was gloved in white cotton. The right was bare and showed the faintest pink blister on 2 fingers. Mr. Basil Blake, the film person from the lodge cottage, had arrived uninvited and unrepentant, wearing a plum-colored velvet jacket and an expression of malicious enjoyment. He lounged against the grand piano, flicking ash from a Turkish cigarette into a Sèvres vase. And finally, in the winged armchair nearest the door, as though ready for instant retreat, sat Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife. She was a tall, untidy woman with graying hair that escaped its pins and a cardigan that had been darned in several places. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were red and capable. The hands of a woman who arranged flowers, typed sermons, and still found time to make blackberry jam for the harvest sale. Craddock cleared his throat. Let us be quite clear. Mr. Reginald Dyer arrived at Gossington Hall sometime before 7:30 this morning. He let himself in with a key he had been given for the purpose of discussing revisions to Colonel Bantry's will. He made himself a cup of coffee in the kitchen, added milk, drank it, and died almost instantly from cyanide poisoning. His body was then wheeled in the laundry basket to the terrace, where Mrs. Eccles discovered him at 8 o'clock. I want to know where each of you was between 6:45 and 8. Colonel Bantry barked at once. Rode out at 7 sharp. Took Merlin over the 5 bar by Jackson's Meadow. Back at 9. Groom will vouch for me. Mrs. Bantry gave a faint moan. Asleep, headache. Didn't stir till my tray came at 8:30. Philippa Curtis spoke in a low, precise voice. I was in the study from 7:30 typing letters the Colonel dictated last night. The typewriter is an Underwood. It makes rather a lot of noise. Anyone in the kitchen would have heard it. Basil Blake grinned. London, dear Inspector. Caught the milk train at 6:50. Here's the return half. He flicked a cardboard ticket onto the table with theatrical disdain. Mrs. Dane Calthrop folded her hands calmly. I left the vicarage at 7:10 to catch the 1/4 bus to Milchester. I needed altar cloth, and Tuesday is the only day Mr. Hedges has the ecclesiastical shade of crimson. The bus was full. Mrs. Burt from the post office sat beside me and talked about her varicose veins the entire way. Craddock made notes and tried not to look discouraged. Miss Marple, who had been given the most comfortable chair and a footstool whether she wanted them or not, sipped her coffee and observed. She observed that Colonel Bantry's riding crop lay on the sideboard with fresh mud on the ferrule, but that the cuffs of his tweed jacket were perfectly clean. No dew from long grass. She observed that Mrs. Bantry's headache powder papers were still in the silver box on her bedside table. Unchanged since yesterday, according to the maid who had just whispered the information to Miss Marple in the hall. She observed that Philippa Curtis kept flexing the gloved left hand as though it pained her. She observed that Basil Blake's return ticket was clipped for yesterday's date, not today's. And she observed that Mrs. Dane Calthrop's sensible walking shoes, placed neatly under her chair, had spotless soles. No trace of the muddy path she would have taken to the bus stop on a frosty morning. But she said nothing at all. She simply smiled her gentle, rather disconcerting smile and accepted another biscuit. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. Very well. No one, it seems, was in the kitchen between 7 and 8. Yet someone brewed fresh coffee, added cyanide, and moved a laundry basket containing a corpse 25 yards across wet grass without leaving footprints. Curious. Mrs. Bantry gave a small scream. Footprints! Oh, Arthur, do you think the flower beds are ruined? Colonel Bantry opened his mouth to roar, thought better of it, and reached for the whiskey decanter instead. Basil Blake laughed outright. My money's on the daily, Inspector. Washerwomen always know where the bodies are buried, or in this case, laundered. Miss Marple set her cup down with a soft chime. Mrs. Eccles has taken the Bantry's washing for 12 years, she said mildly. If she had wished to murder anyone, I feel sure she would have done so long before this, and with starch rather than cyanide. A ripple of nervous laughter ran round the room. Even Craddock smiled. Nevertheless, he said, I shall need to speak to her, and to the servants, and to anyone else who had access to that kitchen. Mrs. Dane Calthrop rose with sudden decision. Then I must go. The vicar will be wondering where his lunch is. As she moved towards the door, Miss Marple noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible smear of violet-scented soap on the cuff of the darned cardigan. She made a small, thoughtful sound, rather like a cat who has seen a particularly interesting mouse disappear behind the wainscot, and reached once more for her knitting. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck the quarter. And in the drawing-room of Gossington Hall, 5 people tried very hard to look as though they had nothing to hide, while Miss Marple's needles clicked softly onward, counting stitches and, quite incidentally, counting lies. Chapter 3, Tea, Scones, and Alibis. Mrs. Bantry, having decided that the only antidote to a corpse in one's laundry basket was a great deal of buttered scones, had ordered tea laid in the morning-room. The French windows stood open to the terrace, where 2 constables were still measuring wheel marks and photographing the basket from every possible angle. A faint smell of bitter almonds lingered like an unwelcome guest. Miss Marple sat beside the tea tray, presiding with the calm authority of a dowager duchess. She had removed her gloves and was buttering a scone with the same neat precision she applied to everything else. Inspector Craddock hovered, notebook in hand, looking as though he would have preferred a quiet afternoon arresting poachers. "Now, Dolly dear," Miss Marple said comfortably, "tell me again about this morning. You say you were asleep." Mrs. Bantry nodded with the fervor of one reciting a catechism. "Dead to the world, ghastly sick headache. Took 2 Vaganin at midnight and never opened an eye till Florence brought my tea at 8:30. You know how these migraines take me." "Indeed I do," Miss Marple murmured. "Yet you were well enough to play bridge last night until 11:30. Curious how suddenly they come on." Mrs. Bantry flushed. "Well, really, Jane," Colonel Bantry cleared his throat noisily. "Nothing curious about it. My wife's health is delicate, always has been." Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the rebuke with a sweetness that somehow made it worse. Philippa Curtis accepted a cup from Miss Marple with her right hand, keeping the gloved left hand in her lap. The glove, Miss Marple noted, was faintly stained at the fingertips with something colorless and greasy, nail varnish remover, perhaps. "You were typing early, Miss Curtis?" Craddock asked. "From 7:30, Philippa replied. "The Colonel had asked me to finish the correspondence about the Malayan shares before the post went. I was in the study the entire time." Craddock made a note. "The study window looks onto the side path. Did you see or hear anyone arrive?" Philippa hesitated the merest fraction. "No. I had the curtain drawn against the sun, and the underwood is very loud." Basil Blake, who had been invited to stay on the grounds that he was practically family, Mrs. Bantry's phrase, and might as well be watched, helped himself to 3 scones and regarded Philippa with lazy amusement. "Funny," he drawled. "I could have sworn I saw a light in the kitchen when I came back from the lodge at about 7:20. I'd been developing photographs all night. Ghastly red darkroom lamp plays havoc with one's eyes. So I stepped out for air. Someone was moving about in there, thought it was the maid." The Colonel snorted. "Maids don't come till 8 on Tuesdays, cook's day off." "Exactly," said Basil, smiling like a cat who has found the cream. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who had returned unexpectedly with a bunch of Michaelmas daisies for Mrs. Bantry, set them down and spoke for the first time. "I wonder," she said in her abrupt, forthright way, "whether we are being a little hasty. Mr. Dyer was not a universally beloved man. There may be people from outside the house who wished him harm." Craddock seized on this gratefully. "Quite. He was a solicitor. Solicitors make enemies." "Indeed they do," Mrs. Dane Calthrop agreed. "Only last week he threatened to expose a trifling irregularity in the Church Restoration Fund accounts. I told him plainly that if he persisted I should be forced to take steps." The room went very still. Even the constables outside seemed to stop measuring. "Steps?" Craddock repeated carefully. Mrs. Dane Calthrop met his gaze without flinching. Spiritual steps, Inspector. Prayer and fasting, and possibly a word with the bishop. I keep cyanide in the vestry cupboard for killing wasps in the organ pipes. It is clearly labeled and locked away. Anyone might have taken it. Miss Marple set down her cup. Curious, she said again, in the tone that made strong men uneasy, because the cyanide was not added to the coffee pot. It was added to Mr. Dyer's cup alone. The dregs in the pot were tested and found clean. Whoever poisoned him knew exactly which cup he would use. A small silence fell. Mrs. Bantry gave a nervous laugh. Well, that lets me out at any rate. I never touch coffee in the mornings. Gives me palpitations. Colonel Bantry reached automatically for the decanter that had been brought in with the tea tray. Philippa Curtis's gloved hand twitched. Basil Blake raised an eyebrow. So the killer was someone who knew Dyer's little habits. Intimate knowledge, one might say. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the tea tray. The coffee service from breakfast had been removed, but the milk jug remained, its contents now cold, a thin skin forming across the surface. She lifted the jug and tipped it gently. The skin broke into delicate fragments. "Tell me, Dolly," she asked, "did you have coffee this morning after all?" Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered. "No, dear, why?" "Because the milk jug on the breakfast tray still has a skin. If someone had added fresh milk to Mr. Dyer's cup after the coffee was poured, the skin would have dissolved. Yet here it is, intact. So the milk and the cyanide went in together before the coffee cooled." Craddock stared at her. "Meaning," Miss Marple said gently, "that the poisoner prepared the cup in advance, knowing Mr. Dyer would help himself. Someone who knew he always took 2 spoons of sugar and a great deal of milk. Someone who had watched him do it many times before." She smiled round the room with great sweetness. "Another scone, anyone?" Outside, the frost had melted entirely now, and the garden lay damp and shining under a pale autumn sun. Inside the morning room, 5 people discovered that their appetites had quite deserted them, while Miss Marple finished her scone with the tranquil appreciation of one who has just placed the first, seemingly harmless stitch in a very complicated pattern indeed. Chapter 4. The matter of the missing laundry Wednesday dawned soft and golden, the sort of autumn day that makes one forgive England all its other weather. Miss Marple took her usual morning walk, down the lane past the post office where Mrs. Burt was already dissecting yesterday's events for an audience of 3 across the green, and home again by way of the vicarage gate. She was back in her own little sitting room by 10 o'clock, settling herself with a fresh skein of wool the color of primroses when the knocker sounded with considerable force. Mrs. Eccles stood on the doorstep, arms akimbo, cheeks redder than the hollyhocks behind her. "They're saying I done it," she announced without preamble. "Me! As if I'd put a corpse in decent sheets and then wheel it across wet grass like a blessed barrow-load of turnips." Miss Marple regarded her calmly. "Come in, Mrs. Eccles, and take a seat. I have just made a pot of coffee. Real coffee, not the dreadful chicory they sell at the Home and Colonial. And there is a cherry cake that wants cutting." Mrs. Eccles was not proof against cherry cake. 10 minutes later, she was seated at the gate-legged table, indignation somewhat mollified by a second slice. "Now," said Miss Marple, pouring coffee with a steady hand, "tell me everything from the beginning." Mrs. Eccles needed no encouragement. "I come up the back path at 8 sharp, same as always Tuesdays. Basket was on the terrace instead of in the scullery where it belongs, lid half off. I thought, that's not like cook, leaving it out in the damp. So I goes to fetch it in, and there's legs sticking out, gray spats and all. I let out one yell and that was that." Miss Marple nodded. "And the previous week's laundry?" "That's the thing." Mrs. Eccles thumped the table so that the cups rattled. I never took it Monday like usual. I had to wait for the copper to be mended, new boilerplate, and it never come till yesterday. So this morning I collects last week's bundle from the scullery shelf, same as always, and brings it straight here to be sure it's safe. She delved into her large marketing bag and produced a brown paper parcel tied with string. I thought you'd want to see it, Miss Marple, seeing as how you notice things. Miss Marple undid the knot with the delicate precision of a surgeon. Out tumbled the expected items. Table napkins with the Bantry monogram, 2 damask cloths, a gentleman's dress shirt with a faint lipstick smudge on the collar, definitely not Mrs. Bantry's shade of tangerine dream, and, tucked between a pillowcase and a tea towel, a single white cotton glove, left hand, slightly stiff at the fingertips. Mrs. Eccles sniffed. That'll be Miss Curtis, always painting her nails with that stinking polish. Leaves her gloves everywhere. Miss Marple held the glove to the light. It was perfectly ordinary, cheap from Marks and Spencer. But the fingertips bore traces of a greasy substance that smelled faintly of acetone, and inside the cuff was a tiny smear of something pale pink. Interesting, she murmured. Mrs. Bantry never wears cotton gloves. Silk for evening, kid for garden parties, but never cotton. She folded the glove carefully and placed it in an envelope. Mrs. Eccles leaned forward confidentially. There's more. When I went back this morning to fetch the laundry, Cook says to me, Funny thing, Mrs. Eccles, the big basket was in its proper place Monday night when I locked up. I'd swear to it on the Bible. So who moved it out to the terrace in the dark? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed like winter sky. Someone who wished the body to be found quickly, yet not too quickly. Someone who knew you arrived at 8 sharp, Mrs. Eccles, and would be sure to scream. Mrs. Eccles bridled with reluctant pride. I do have good lungs. Excellent lungs, Miss Marple agreed. Now one last thing. Did you notice anything on the path? A footprint, perhaps? A dropped button? Mrs. Eccles considered, then shook her head. Only that the dew was broken where the basket had been wheeled and a scrap of white stuff caught on the rosemary bush. Looked like cotton lint, I thought. Nothing of it. Miss Marple made a small, satisfied sound. At 11 o'clock she presented herself at Gossington Hall, armed with the cherry cake. One must never arrive empty-handed. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with relief. Jane, thank heaven. The police have been photographing my terrace all morning. Arthur has taken to his study with the whiskey. Do come and cheer us up. In the drawing room they found Philippa Curtis at the writing desk, typing with one bare hand while the gloved left lay in her lap. She looked up, startled, when Miss Marple entered. Good morning, Miss Curtis, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I hope your poor hand is better. Philippa flushed. Much, thank you. I burned it on the curling tongs Saturday night. So silly. Very painful, Miss Marple sympathized. I always find a little cold cream works wonders, though one must be careful not to get it on one's gloves. Philippa's gloved fingers curled involuntarily. Mrs. Bantry, mercifully oblivious, rang for fresh coffee. Miss Marple accepted a cup and wandered to the French windows. The terrace still bore the chalk marks of police measurements. She stepped outside, apparently admiring the view, and bent to examine the rosemary bush by the steps. There, caught on a prickly leaf, was a tiny tuft of white cotton threads. She plucked it free, tucked it into her handkerchief, and returned indoors with a serene smile. Such a pretty herb garden, Dolly. Though I always think rosemary is for remembrance and secrets. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. Philippa Curtis did not. Back in her own cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple laid out her discoveries on the little table. The single left-hand glove, the tuft of cotton, the faint smear of violet-scented soap she had noticed yesterday on Mrs. Dane Calthrop's cuff, and the thread she had taken from the laundry basket on the fatal morning. She regarded them for a long moment, then picked up her knitting again. "Dear me," she said softly to the empty room. "How very careless people are with their left hands." Outside, the church clock struck 3. Somewhere in the village, a murderer was trying very hard to appear innocent, unaware that an old lady with primrose wool and a most inconvenient memory was gently, inexorably, pulling at the one loose thread that would unravel everything. Chapter 5. The Red Herring of the Love Letters. Thursday brought a cold, steady rain that turned the lanes of St. Mary Mead into glossy ribbons and kept most sensible people indoors. Inspector Craddock, however, was not sensible. He was determined. He arrived at Gossington Hall just after luncheon with a small cardboard box tied with pink tape and an expression that suggested he had finally caught a fish, only to discover it might be the wrong one. Mrs. Bantry received him in the morning room where the fire had been lit early and the air smelled of damp dogs and apprehension. "Dermot, dear boy, you look soaked. Do take off that coat. Florence has made a seed cake." Craddock declined the seed cake with a politeness that bordered on desperation. "I've come from Milchester," he said, placing the box on the table. "These were found locked in Miss Curtis's desk at the office she keeps here. Love letters, very passionate ones. Signed only R." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened like saucers. "Philippa, in love? With the dead man?" "So it would appear." At that moment, Philippa herself entered, carrying a pile of estate ledgers. She stopped on the threshold, color draining from her face as she saw the box. Craddock opened it with deliberate care. A dozen sheets of heavy cream paper, folded small, spilled out. The handwriting was bold, masculine, impatient. "My darling girl, I count the hours until I can hold you again. You are the only pure thing in my corrupt little world." Philippa made a small, choked sound. "May I?" Miss Marple asked quietly. She had arrived 10 minutes earlier on the pretext of returning a library book and had been quietly installed in the corner with her knitting ever since. Craddock handed her the letters. Miss Marple read 2, lips pursed, then passed them back. "Very ardent," she observed. "Though I always think gentlemen who write 'I burn for you' have usually been reading too many novels. Still, young women are impressionable." Philippa found her voice. "They are private," she said with stiff dignity. "Reginald and we were going to be married. He broke it off 3 weeks ago, said it was impossible. I kept the letters because I could not bear to destroy them." Mrs. Bantry gave a sympathetic cluck. Craddock looked grim. "These letters," he said, "place you in a very difficult position, Miss Curtis. A woman scorned—" Philippa laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You think I poisoned him because he jilted me. Inspector, I am not a Victorian melodrama." "Perhaps not," Craddock said, "but someone put cyanide in his cup and you were in the house." Miss Marple's needles clicked peacefully. "Tell me, Miss Curtis," she asked, "when exactly did you burn your hand?" Philippa looked startled by the change of subject. "Saturday evening. The curling tongs slipped." "Both hands?" "No, only the left. The right is quite all right." She held it out as proof, then realized what she had done and colored. Miss Marple nodded. "I wonder if we might see the right-hand glove that matches the one in the laundry, just to complete the picture." Philippa hesitated, then went to the desk and opened a drawer. She produced a second white cotton glove, clean, neatly folded, quite unmarked. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered. Craddock frowned. At that moment the door burst open and Basil Blake sauntered in, shaking rain from a vivid emerald mackintosh. "Hello, hello. Am I interrupting the inquest?" His bright, malicious gaze fell on the letters. "Ah, the famous billets doux. I rather thought they'd surface." Craddock rounded on him. "You know something about these." Blake laughed. "My dear Inspector, I wrote them. Every purple word. I have a weakness for high-flown nonsense when I've had a drink or three. Dyer was posting them to my wife in town, trying to make trouble. The joke rather backfired when she sent them back with "Return to sender addressee unknown" scrawled across the envelope. He fished in his pocket and produced an identical sheet of cream paper, flourished it like a conjurer, then tossed it onto the pile. See? Same stationery, same fountain pen ink, Waterman's emerald. Dyer's little idea of a practical joke. Hardly worth killing a man for, though some might disagree. Philippa stared at the letters as though they had turned into spiders. They weren't. He never. Her voice cracked. She pressed a hand to her mouth and fled the room. Mrs. Bantry started after her, then subsided, fluttering. "Well," she exclaimed, "men are beasts." Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "Poor child," she said gently. "To be made a fool of twice. Once by the man, once by the letters. No wonder she has been so pale." Craddock ran a hand through his hair, scattering raindrops. "So the letters are a blind, another dead end." "Not quite," Miss Marple said. "They tell us something important. Mr. Dyer enjoyed tormenting people. He liked to see them squirm. That is a dangerous hobby in a small village." She rose and went to the window. Rain streaked the panes. Beyond, the terrace glistened like black marble. "Someone," she murmured, "has been tormented once too often." Behind her, Basil Blake lit another Turkish cigarette and smiled at the ceiling. "Careful, Aunt Jane," he said softly. "You're beginning to sound almost bloodthirsty." Miss Marple turned, her eyes very bright. "Not at all, Mr. Blake, merely observant. And observation, as I always say, is the beginning of understanding." She returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed the placid rhythm that had unraveled more than one guilty conscience in its time. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the chalk marks from the terrace stones, carrying away footprints and secrets alike, except the ones that Miss Marple had already tucked safely away in the neat, orderly drawers of her mind. Chapter 6. The garden party that wasn't Saturday broke clear and mild, the kind of Indian summer day that makes English people believe winter has been cancelled. Mrs. Bantry, who had spent the week oscillating between hysterics and heroic stoicism, announced that the only possible cure for a corpse in the laundry basket was a garden party. "We shall have it on the lawn," she declared over the telephone to half the village. "No one need go near the terrace. We shall be perfectly cheerful, and Arthur will open the new rosebed. People must stop whispering." People, of course, came in droves. The murder had given St. Mary Mead its first real excitement since the postmistress eloped with the Baptist minister in 1937, and no one intended to miss the next act. By 3 o'clock, the south lawn was bright with hats and chatter. A string quartet from Milchester sawed valiantly at Haydn under the cedar tree. Tables groaned beneath cucumber sandwiches, Victoria sponge, and Mrs. Bantry's famous strawberry ice, made mercifully long before cyanide entered the conversation. Miss Marple arrived at 3:20 wearing dove-gray silk and the small straw hat she kept for weddings and funerals. She accepted a cup of tea from the vicar's wife and settled herself on a white iron chair from which she could see everything. Colonel Bantry, resplendent in blazer and flannels, was already on his second pink gin and refilling with the stealth of a man who believes no one is watching. Philippa Curtis moved among the guests like a pale ghost, wearing a sleeveless hyacinth blue frock that left both arms bare. The burn on her left hand had faded to 2 faint pink blisters. She kept the hand half curled as though it still hurt. She wore no gloves at all today. Basil Blake had brought a party of London friends, young women in enormous sunglasses and young men who called everyone darling, and photographed everything with Leica cameras. They treated the murder as a delicious joke and kept asking the constable on duty whether he had brought his handcuffs. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, in an unfortunate bottle-green coat and skirt, was deep in conversation with Mr. Pritchard, the chemist from Much Benham. Every time the chemist leaned forward to emphasize a point, Mrs. Dane Calthrop took a small, involuntary step backwards. Miss Marple observed all this with the mild interest of a naturalist watching birds at a feeder. At 3:30, Colonel Bantry mounted the steps by the rose-bed and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we declare the roses officially open, a few words." He was spared the necessity by the sudden appearance of young Tommy Symington, the gardener's boy, who came hurtling across the lawn clutching a pair of gray spats. "Colonel, sir, look what I found in the potting shed loft. Thought they was yours, but they're too small and they've got them funny pearl buttons." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. The spats were passed from hand to hand until they reached Inspector Craddock, who had arrived in plain clothes and now looked as though he wished he hadn't. Colonel Bantry went the color of ripe beetroot. "Never seen 'em before in my life." Mrs. Bantry gave a small, strangled sound. "Arthur, they're exactly like the ones the dead man was wearing." Tommy, delighted to be the center of attention, piped up, "Found 'em wrapped in newspaper with a load of old seed packets right at the back. Been there weeks, I shouldn't wonder." Craddock took possession of the spats and turned them over thoughtfully. The mother-of-pearl buttons winked in the sunlight. Miss Marple rose and came forward. "May I, Dermot, dear?" She examined the spats with care, then handed them back. "Size 8, she said quietly. "Mr. Dyer took a 9.5, and the leather is scarcely scuffed. Someone bought these recently, intending them to be recognized." A murmur ran through the crowd. Basil Blake's laugh rang out. "My money's on the Colonel. Always said he had murderous taste in footwear." The Colonel made a noise like a furious bull. Mrs. Bantry began to fan herself violently. At that moment, Mrs. Dane Calthrop detached herself from the chemist and approached Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, a word, if you please." She drew the old lady aside behind the shelter of a large rhododendron. "I must speak," she said in a low, hurried voice. "I cannot bear it any longer. The cyanide came from the vestry cupboard. I noticed the bottle was lower than it should be on Tuesday morning. I said nothing because I thought it might have been the vicar sleepwalking again. But now I am not sure. I have been praying for guidance and—" Her voice broke. She pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Miss Marple patted her arm with gentle firmness. "My dear, you must tell Inspector Craddock everything, at once." Mrs. Dane Calthrop nodded, drew a deep breath, and walked straight to Craddock. Within minutes, the garden party had dissolved into little knots of excited whispering. Mrs. Bantry, near tears, announced that the roses were open and everyone might go home. Miss Marple lingered by the deserted tea-table, watching the guests depart. Philippa Curtis stood alone on the terrace steps, staring at the chalk marks that still showed faintly where the laundry basket had stood. Miss Marple went to her. "You are thinking of him," she said softly. Philippa started. "I was thinking how cruel people can be," she answered, voice trembling. "Those letters, everyone believing I killed him for love. I hated him in the end, but I did not kill him." "No," Miss Marple said, "you did not." She looked past Philippa to the scullery door, then down at the grass, still bearing the faint twin tracks of wheels. "Someone moved the basket after death," she murmured. "Someone strong enough to drag a man's body 25 yards in the dark, yet careful enough to wipe the handle clean. Someone who knew exactly when Mrs. Eccles would arrive." Philippa turned away, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple watched her go, then walked slowly across the lawn to where Inspector Craddock was sealing the spats in a paper bag. "Another blind alley, I'm afraid," he said gloomily. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied. "Or perhaps the murderer has just shown us the first honest thing they have done all week. Vanity." Those spats were meant to be found, Dermot, just not quite yet. She smiled her small cat-like smile and accepted a lift home in the police car. Behind them, the deserted garden lay golden in the late sun, and the new rosebed, hastily dug only yesterday, gave off the faintest, most disturbing scent of freshly turned earth. Chapter 7. The Crucial Timetable. Sunday morning in St. Mary Mead was always quiet, but this Sunday felt hushed in a different way, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The bells of St. Mary the Virgin called the faithful to matins. The scent of damp leaves and coal smoke drifted over the rooftops, and in her small, immaculate sitting room, Miss Jane Marple sat at the gate-legged table with a large sheet of writing paper, a fountain pen, and the calm concentration of a general before battle. She wrote in her neat, slanted hand, 6:40 a.m. Milkman Bert Rundle sees light in Gossington Hall kitchen window. 6:55 a.m. Mr. Reginald Dyer lets himself in at the side door with his own key. 7:07 on 10 a.m. Coffee is brewed on the gas ring, fresh grounds later found in the kitchen bin. 7 on 12 a.m. Dyer pours himself a cup, adds milk and 2 spoons of sugar, his invariable habit. 7 on 13 a.m. Drinks, collapses almost instantly. 7 on 15, 7:45 a.m. Body is dragged across scullery, placed in laundry basket, basket wheeled out to terrace. 7:50 a.m. Murderer departs by the side path, no footprints because the grass was still heavy with dew. 8:00 a.m. Mrs. Eccles arrives, discovers body, screams. She underlined the 30-minute gap between 7:15 and 7:45 3 times. 30 minutes, she murmured to the quiet room. Time enough, but only just. Inspector Craddock arrived at 10:30, still in his church suit and looking faintly guilty for working on the Sabbath. Aunt Jane, I've had the laboratory report. The cyanide was potassium cyanide, identical to the bottle in the vicarage vestry. Mrs. Dane Calthrop has been helping us with our inquiries since yesterday afternoon. Miss Marple poured him coffee without asking. Sit down, Dermot dear, and do stop hovering. Tell me, did the bottle have fingerprints? Smudged. Someone wiped it carefully, then put it back. But there are traces of violet-scented soap on the stopper. The vicar's wife uses Wright's coal tar for everything else, but she keeps a tablet of Yardley's lavender for guests. Miss Marple nodded. And the laundry basket handle? Wiped clean, except for a faint smear of the same soap and a trace of cold cream. Pond's, the chemist says. She pushed her timetable across the table. Look at the times, Dermot. Whoever did this had to know Mr. Dyer would arrive early, had to prepare the cup in advance, and had to be strong enough, or desperate enough, to move a dead weight 25 yards in the dark without being seen or heard. Craddock read, frowning. The colonel was out riding by 7. Mrs. Bantry was in bed. Philippa Curtis says she was typing. Basil Blake was supposedly in London. Mrs. Dane Calthrop caught the 7:15 bus. Miss Marple tapped the paper gently. Yet someone was in that kitchen. Someone who knew exactly which cup Mr. Dyer would choose. The one with the chipped handle, because he always joked that it was his cup when he visited. Someone who had watched him dozens of times. Craddock rubbed his temples. We're going round in circles. No, Miss Marple said serenely. We are going round a very small, very exclusive circle. And circles, you know, always bring one back to the starting point. She rose and went to the window. The churchgoers were coming out now, black coats and Sunday hats dotted across the green like croquet hoops. Tell me, Dermot, when you searched the house, did you look in the hot water cupboard on the first-floor landing? Craddock stared. No. Why on earth? Because that is where the maids keep spare laundry baskets when the big one is in use. And because yesterday when I borrowed Dolly's umbrella, I noticed a folded linen bag on the shelf that had a most interesting stain. Faint, brownish, about the size of a man's shoe. Blood does not wash out completely, you know, not if it has dried. Craddock reached for his hat. At Gossington Hall an hour later they found the bag exactly where Miss Marple had described it. The stain tested positive for human blood, Mr. Dyer's group, and caught in the wicker rim was another tiny tuft of white cotton threads. Craddock turned to Miss Marple almost pleadingly. But who? We have alibis, motives, red herrings. We have something better, Miss Marple said. We have the left hand. She laid her small collection on the morning room table. The single left-hand glove from the laundry, the right-hand glove Philippa had produced, the tufts of cotton from the rosemary bush and the spare basket, the smear of violet soap, the trace of cold cream. Notice, she said, that every clue points to the left hand. The glove found with the body is a left. The burn Philippa suffered was on her left hand. She could not have gripped the basket handle on Tuesday morning without agony. The cold cream is on the left cuff of Mrs. Dane Calthrop's cardigan, and the spats found yesterday. Did you examine the buttons? Craddock looked blank. The mother-of-pearl buttons are sewn on left over right, Miss Marple explained patiently. Men's spats button right over left. Those were made for a woman or altered by one. Vanity again, Dermot. The murderer wanted us to think of Mr. Dyer even when planting false clues. Craddock sat down rather suddenly. You're saying a woman moved the body. I am saying, Miss Marple corrected gently, that a woman who is taller and stronger than she lets people believe did it. A woman who cycles 3 miles to the bus stop every other day. Who arranges the church flowers standing on ladders, who can lift a full coal, scuttle without help. A woman who was seen leaving the vicarage at 7:10, but who could easily have cycled here, done the deed, and still caught the later bus from the crossroads at 7:25. Craddock stared at her. Mrs. Dane Calthrop? Miss Marple inclined her head. Tomorrow, she said. I shall ask her to tea. One should always offer a cup of tea before asking someone to confess to murder. It is only polite. Outside, the Sunday bells had fallen silent. In the quiet that followed, the case against the vicar's wife began to take shape, not with dramatic thunder, but with the soft, inexorable click of Miss Marple's knitting needles counting down to 0. Chapter 8. The Washerwoman's True Clue. Monday arrived wrapped in soft gray mist, the sort that muffles church bells and makes even the most respectable cottages look mysterious. At 2:30 precisely, Mrs. Eccles knocked at Miss Marple's front door with the triumphant air of a woman who has remembered something important after 3 days of turning it over in her mind like a troublesome sock heel. I've got it now, miss, she announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation and untying her headscarf in the same motion. Clear as clear. Tuesday morning when I come up the back path, the lid of the basket was on crooked like, and there was a white glove caught in it, just the fingertips poking out. I straightened the lid, couldn't bear anything untidy, not even with a corpse inside, and I tucked the glove proper in so it wouldn't get mucked up with dew. Never thought twice about it till last night, lying awake. Miss Marple received this news with the solemnity due to a major revelation. So the glove was already in the basket when you arrived, she said quietly. Thank you, Mrs. Eccles. You have just removed the very last knot. Mrs. Eccles beamed, accepted a slice of Madeira cake and a cup of tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, and departed 20 minutes later with the comfortable feeling that she had been of national importance. At 4 o'clock, Miss Marple telephoned Gossington Hall and asked in her gentlest voice whether Mrs. Dane Calthrop might care to take tea with her the following afternoon. Just us 2 ladies, she added, and perhaps Inspector Craddock if he is free. Nothing formal. Mrs. Dane Calthrop accepted at once, sounding, Miss Marple thought, both relieved and resigned. Tuesday came in pale and cold. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room snapped cheerfully. The table was laid with the best Royal Albert and a plate of scones still warm from the oven. At 3 the garden gate clicked, and Mrs. Dane Calthrop appeared at the window like a tall, bedraggled crow. She had walked from the vicarage without a coat. Her gray hair was beaded with moisture, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, as though greeting an old friend after a fortnight's holiday rather than the chief suspect in a murder. "The fire is lovely and the scones are just ready." Mrs. Dane Calthrop sat on the edge of the chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You want the truth," she said without preamble. "I am glad. I have not slept since Saturday." Miss Marple poured tea, added exactly the right amount of milk, and passed the cup. "Begin," she said kindly, "with why you keep cyanide in the vestry." Mrs. Dane Calthrop gave a shaky laugh. "Wasps in the organ pipes. The vicar is allergic. I label it clearly and lock the cupboard. But Reginald Dyer came to see me a fortnight ago. He had discovered that I have been diverting small sums from the Restoration Fund." She looked up, defiant now. "My brother David is in a private home near Oxford. He is 47 and has the mind of a child of 5. The county asylum is a terrible place. I could not let him go there, so I took £1 here, 10 shillings there, always meaning to repay it when the bazaar money came in. Dyer found out. He threatened to expose me unless I paid him £200. I haven't got 200 pence. Miss Marple nodded, neither shocked nor surprised. "So when he telephoned on Monday to say he would call early next morning to collect the first installment, I lost my reason," Mrs. Dane Calthrop said simply. "I cycled over at 6:30. I thought if I faced him down, begged him. I took the cyanide bottle with me, meaning only to threaten. He laughed at me, said the vicar's wife in the dock would be the making of his career. I was shaking. I tipped a little into the cup I knew he would use, the chipped one he always chose. I only meant to frighten him, but he drank it straight down." Her voice cracked. He looked so surprised. Then he fell forward, and I knew. Miss Marple handed her a clean handkerchief. "And the basket?" I panicked. I could not leave him on the floor for the maids to find. The laundry basket was there waiting for Mrs. Eccles. I dragged him across. He was heavier than I expected, and wheeled the basket out to the terrace so it would be discovered quickly. I thought if the body were found by daylight, people would assume an outsider had done it. I wiped the handle with my handkerchief. I always carry Yardley's soap because the vicar dislikes the smell of carbolic. And I wore cotton gloves because of the acid. I lost the left one somewhere I never noticed. She gave a watery smile. I caught the 7:25 bus from the crossroads after all. Mrs. Burt talked about her veins the whole way, and I nodded as though nothing had happened. A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the bracket clock. Inspector Craddock, who had been sitting quietly in the corner armchair with a writing pad, closed it softly. "Mrs. Dane Calthrop, I must ask you to accompany me to the station." She rose at once, steady now. "Yes, I am ready." At the door she turned back to Miss Marple. "Will you tell the vicar?" "Gently. He will not understand at first, but he must be told." Miss Marple pressed her hand. "I shall go to him myself, and I shall make sure David is cared for. There are funds, quiet funds, for just such cases." Mrs. Dane Calthrop's eyes filled again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I have been so afraid of kindness." When the police car had driven away, Miss Marple stood at her gate for a long moment, watching the mist swallow the tail lights. Then she went indoors, closed the door, and sat down beside the fire. "Pride," she said to the empty room. "And love, the two things that make murderers of the best of us. She picked up her knitting, something small and soft in pale yellow wool, and began, very steadily, to cast off. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room Denouement. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had been chosen because it was large enough for everyone and because Mrs. Bantry insisted that, if we must have a denouement, let it be civilized. A fire crackled in the grate. The chandeliers were lit. The French windows stood open to the cool, dark garden so that no one could claim later they had felt trapped. They were all there. Colonel Bantry, rigid in his old dinner jacket, stood beside the mantelpiece clutching a whiskey as though it were a hand grenade. Mrs. Bantry fluttered in pale blue lace, darting anxious glances at the door. Philippa Curtis, very white but composed, sat on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap, both hands now bare and healed. Basil Blake lounged by the grand piano, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers, watching the scene with the detached amusement of a man at the theater. Inspector Craddock stood in the center, correct and grave. Beside him, unexpectedly, sat the vicar, small, bewildered, clutching his hat like a life-belt. He had been told only that something must be explained. Miss Marple occupied the small brocade chair nearest the fire, upright, tranquil, her silver hair shining softly in the lamplight. She wore the dove-gray silk she kept for important occasions and the single string of pearls that had belonged to her mother. In her lap lay her knitting, but the needles were still. Craddock cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple has asked me to gather you all here so that the events of last Tuesday morning may be laid out plainly once and for all." Colonel Bantry gave a gruff bark. "About time. Village is becoming impossible. Can't buy a pound of sausages without being asked if I poisoned my solicitor." Mrs. Bantry gave a small, hysterical moan. Craddock continued. "We know how Mr. Dyer died. Potassium cyanide in his coffee. We know when. Between 7 and 7:30. We know the body was moved in the laundry basket to the terrace. What we needed was the one person who combined motive, opportunity, and the physical strength to do it." He paused. Every eye turned slowly, reluctantly, to the empty chair beside the vicar. The vicar himself looked round, puzzled. "Where is my wife? She promised to be here." Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. "She is with the police, Mr. Calthrop. She asked me to speak for her tonight." A collective intake of breath. Basil Blake's cigarette dropped ash onto the parquet. The vicar's wife? Good Lord! Philippa Curtis pressed a hand to her mouth. Colonel Bantry went scarlet. "Preposterous! Woman's a saint. Does the flowers, visits the sick." "Exactly," Miss Marple said quietly. "A saint, who discovered that saints can be blackmailed." She rose, small and straight as a steel needle. "Reginald Dyer was not a nice man. He enjoyed power. He discovered that Mrs. Dane Calthrop had been taking small sums from the Church Restoration Fund to pay for her brother's care in a private home. The brother is simple. The county asylum would have been the alternative. Dyer demanded £200 to keep silent. She hadn't got it. He threatened exposure. She lost her head." Mrs. Bantry began to cry softly into a lace handkerchief. "On Monday evening, he telephoned to say he would call at 7 the next morning to collect the first installment. Mrs. Dane Calthrop cycled over at 6:30. She took the cyanide from the vestry, labeled, locked away, but she had the key. She intended only to threaten him. When he laughed, she tipped a fatal dose into the cup she knew he always used, the one with the tiny chip in the handle. He drank. He died." The vicar made a small, bewildered sound. Miss Marple went on, gently relentless. "Then panic. She dragged the body to the laundry basket, wheeled it to the terrace so that Mrs. Eccles would find it quickly and the crime would look like an outsider's work. She wore white cotton gloves to protect her hands from the acid bottle. She lost the left one in her haste. Mrs. Eccles, tidying even in the face of horror, tucked the glove inside the basket and straightened the crooked lid. That is the washerwoman's true clue. She looked round the room with great compassion. She wiped the basket handle with her handkerchief, hence the violet soap and cold cream. She caught the later bus from the crossroads. And all week she has carried the burden alone, praying for courage to confess. Silence. Only the fire snapped. The vicar stood up slowly, hat crushed in his hands. My wife murdered a man? She believed she was protecting the helpless, Miss Marple said. And her pride, always her pride, would not let her beg or borrow the money. Pride is a terrible thing, Vicar. It makes us forget we are not God. Colonel Bantry found his voice. But the spats in the potting shed, planted later, Craddock said, by Mrs. Dane Calthrop herself to throw suspicion onto the colonel. She bought them in Milchester the previous week, intending them to be found eventually. Vanity, you see, even in guild. Philippa Curtis spoke for the first time, very low. I was cruel to her. I thought she was dowdy and interfering. I never looked properly. Miss Marple smiled at her. None of us looked properly, my dear. That is the tragedy. She turned to the vicar. Your wife has made a full confession. She will be charged, but there will be mercy. The judge will understand desperation, and the brother will be cared for. I shall see to that personally. The vicar bowed his head. Tears fell onto his hat. Mrs. Bantry sobbed aloud. Oh, that poor, poor woman. Basil Blake stubbed out his cigarette, suddenly sober. Well, he said quietly, that rather takes the shine off murder, doesn't it? Miss Marple resumed her seat and picked up her knitting. It always did, Mr. Blake, she said. That is why decent people seldom commit it. The fire settled into embers. Outside, a night wind stirred the dark garden where only a week ago a laundry basket had stood like a grotesque monument to human frailty. Inside, no one moved for a very long time. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Understanding. 3 weeks later, on a bright, cold morning in early October, Miss Marple sat in her little sitting room with the French windows open to the garden so that the last roses could perfume the air. The case was officially closed. Mrs. Dane Calthrop had appeared at the assizes, pleaded guilty to manslaughter on grounds of grave provocation, and been sentenced to 3 years, a sentence so light that the newspapers called it the mercy of much Benham. The vicar had gone to live quietly with a sister in Devon. The brother David was safe in a pleasant home near Oxford, paid for by an anonymous trust that bore in very small handwriting at the bottom of the deed the initials J.M. Inspector Craddock arrived at 11 o'clock sharp, hat in hand, looking younger than his 35 years and rather sheepish. I brought scones from the Blue Boar, he announced, producing a paper bag. The proper ones with clotted cream and Mrs. Patchett's raspberry jam. Thought we deserved a celebration. Miss Marple smiled and set out the best cups, the ones with the gold rims that she allowed herself only on birthdays and after murders. Sit down, Dermot dear. You look as though you have been worrying. Craddock accepted tea and a scone, then sighed. I keep thinking we should have seen it sooner. All of us. She was breaking her heart in front of the whole village, and we were too busy chasing spats and love letters. Miss Marple buttered her scone with care. We saw what we expected to see. That is the trouble with human beings. We are so very predictable. A colonel short of money, a beautiful secretary, a scandalous young man from London. Any detective novelist would have chosen one of them. But life is not a detective novel. Sometimes the murderer is the person who brings you soup when you have influenza and never forgets a birthday. Craddock stirred his tea unnecessarily. The vicar came to see me yesterday. Wanted to thank you. said you had saved his faith as well as his brother-in-law's future. Miss Marple looked modestly at the teapot. I merely reminded certain charitable persons that the restoration fund could be restored in other ways. Anonymous donations are such a comfort to the pride. Craddock grinned suddenly. Mrs. Bantry has turned the terrace into a rose garden. Says laundry baskets give her the vapors now. And Philippa Curtis has given notice. She's going to Secretarial College in London. Says she never wants to type another will. A very sensible girl, Miss Marple approved. She has learnt that beauty is not enough protection against cruelty. A hard lesson, but a useful one. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to blackbirds arguing in the apple tree. Craddock set down his cup. You know what the super said when the file was closed? Another of Miss Marple's little village tragedies. Thank God she's on our side. Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. I am on nobody's side, Dermot. Only on the side of truth and of kindness when the two can be persuaded to walk together. She rose and went to the window. The sun was climbing, turning the fallen leaves to gold. Mrs. Eccles came yesterday, she said. The parish council has voted her a pension of 10 shillings a week for life in grateful recognition of services rendered. She is buying a new mangle and has named it Justice. Craddock laughed outright. And Basil Blake? Back in London making a film about a beautiful girl who poisons her lovers. He sent me an invitation to the premiere. I declined. I have seen quite enough drama for one autumn. She turned back to the room, eyes suddenly serious. Do you know what Mrs. Dane Calthrop's last words were before they took her away? Tell Miss Marple I am not sorry he is dead, only that I killed him. There, you see, is the whole sad story in one sentence. Hate and love twisted together like briars. Craddock stood up, hat in hand. I must get back. There's a burglary in Much Benham, post office this time. Real criminals for a change. Miss Marple walked him to the gate. Give my love to your mother and tell her the new baby jacket is almost finished. Pale yellow, goes with either sex. At the gate he paused. Aunt Jane, how did you know it was the left glove that mattered? She smiled, the small seraphic smile that had discomposed stronger men than he. Because, my dear, I have knitted since I was 7 years old. One always notices the hand that does the work, and murderers like knitters are betrayed by their loose threads. Craddock drove away, shaking his head, half in admiration, half in despair. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up the pale yellow wool, and began the final rows. Outside, St. Mary Mead went about its gentle business. The butcher's boy whistled on his bicycle. Mrs. Price beat a rug with unnecessary violence, and somewhere a child laughed because the world for the moment was safe again. She finished the sleeve, snipped the wool, and held the little jacket to the light. Perfect, she said softly. One must always finish what one begins. And in the quiet room, with the scent of roses and wood smoke and the last warmth of an autumn fire, Miss Jane Marple drank the final cold mouthful of tea and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, entirely at peace with the world and all its frail, fallible creatures.